Sheriff's Office.
Hi, ma'am. This is Scott Dunford. Today at 324, 327, and 328, I had 3 census trips, and I've been out of town with family for a funeral. My wife was home.
Okay.
I just got home, and the board that I have over my back door has been broken. So somebody has forced their way in, and I haven't heard back from my wife. I need an officer here now.
Okay. And what's your wife's name?
Desiree Sunford.
24.
When I rolled up to the residence, I saw somebody had their spotlight on the house, and he had a pistol drawn. That person was later identified as Scott Sunford. And I asked him what was going on. Why didn't you go in? He said, I don't know what's in there. It was a very odd answer to give. I entered the house, and I remember walking down the hallway, and the first room to my left, and there were bullet casings on the floor. To the left, I could see the body of Desiree Sunford. She was partially dressed. I believe she was in a nightgown, pretty bloody. I could see bullet holes in her body. She had been shot numerous times. It wasn't a burglary that had gone bad. Whoever shot her wanted her dead. At that point, when I had exited the house and walked over to Mr. Sunford and told him that there was a deceased woman in the house. We believe it's your wife. I remember telling him, I'm terribly sorry. I'm terribly sorry. He had a stone cold look on his face. It seemed like it meant nothing to him. And I told the detectives when they arrived on scene, I think this guy knows something about this. Either he did it, or he knew who did.
Deputies are still trying to paint the picture of what led to the shooting of Desiree Sunford.
The life of the beloved art teacher gone.
Desiree Sunford was a 30-year-old middle school art teacher who had a wonderful smile. She had a great personality. Desiree was a very bubbly person. She liked comedy. She loved to laugh. She loved music. Everything about her was that upbeat personality. She had very specific traits that made her highly qualified as a teacher. She seemed to make connections with the kids, like she was one of them.
She was well liked by her coworkers, the kids in the school district. Just a very good, very nice, genuine person.
She was smart, she was outgoing, and she loved her motorcycle. We don't get that many teachers that want to ride bikes. She was into it instantly, almost like the first big ride, at least 20, 30-mile ride we went on, she where are we going now? She really liked it.
Desiree Sunford's death is being felt here at Wapato Middle School.
I couldn't imagine what somebody would have wanted to kill her for, what purpose there was behind it. I was dumbfounded.
It kind of didn't make any sense because where we live, we might hear of a robbery or something here and there, but a break-in, but nothing like that. I think everybody was wondering what was going on and nobody really knew. I mean, they were getting bits and pieces and nobody really wanted to assume anything.
Scott Sunford was a big guy, about 6'5", very neatly groomed.
He was a 31-year-old veteran in the National Guard. He actually worked at the local training center for the military base here in Yakima County. I've never seen that in any of the cases I've worked where they're trying to psych themselves up or calm themselves down to prepare them for an interview.
Push is regained. Here we go. We're ready.
All right. Getting some clothes brought over from the house so that you can change it.
We want him to feel comfortable and see what we can start locking him into some kind of a story.
Are you going to keep talking to me now about what happened out at your house?
Of course.
Okay.
As much as I can. I mean, I can't help you too much. I wasn't there, but...
Well, I wasn't either, and I just got here, so that's where I'm asking you to jump in and help me fill in the blanks as far as what led us out there.
Scott informed us that he had gone down to the Tri-Cities, which is about an hour and a half, 2 hours south of Yakima, to attend a funeral. And he attended the funeral Saturday afternoon, and then he had called Desiree, said he was going to spend the night down there.
I told her, you know, it's kind of rainy, it's windy, tired as hell, long day, and they want to do a breakfast get-together in the morning. I'm going to stay here for the night.
Did she indicate that anything was wrong or everything seemed okay?
No, it was fine. Yeah, it was just a quick, hi, yeah, looks like I'm going to stay. It's going kind of long. Love you. Talk to you soon. See you tomorrow. You know.
You mentioned that you got a bunch of alarm hits on through your phone at like 3 in the morning.
He received texts from the alarm company saying something had gone wrong or something tripped the alarm.
All along the drive home, I just kept calling her randomly, trying to get a hold of her. My stomach was churning. I was shaking. I had convinced myself by that point something had to be wrong.
Okay, and so why not go in the house and check things out and make sure she's okay?
Because I was afraid.
What were you afraid of?
When I saw that back door, I just couldn't decide whether I could deal with what I may or may not see.
It didn't make sense that a husband would stand back and not go into the house to see if his wife's hurt or injured.
You said you were in the military?
Yeah, 13 years.
13 years? Did you get deployed in combat areas?
Yeah, we had a couple deployments.
Where at?
Iraq.
Iraq. Well, I'm just thinking, you're a big guy. You're what, 6'4"?
Somewhere up there.
6'4", 250. You've got a firearm on you. You've been in combat. I mean, you've done some serious that most people will never do. So if anyone's going to be willing to go charging in the house and make sure their wife's okay, it would seem to me that it would be you.
Well, it's not that I was afraid of anybody being in there. You know, I'll take on 100 people for her, that's fine.
Yeah.
That wasn't the concern, it was her.
You just don't want to see what may have happened to her.
Yeah.
And what did you think you might see if you went inside?
Roll around 1,000 of the worst things you could think of.
In my 30-year career, I have never seen anything like this. For a guy his size, stature, and armed with a .45 to wait for a police officer to show up to check on the welfare of his wife. And then his reaction after finding out that she had been shot multiple times and was dead on the floor. Things were not adding up. What he was telling us, it stunk. Something was wrong here.
Hello everyone, the timeline might be the key to solving the murder of a local art teacher.
They found her shot to death in her home on North St. Hilaire Road Sunday night. Deputies only went there after getting a call from her husband. He told them he was out of town, and he was worried after not hearing anything from her in more than a day.
How long have you two been married?
10 in November.
10? Oh.
Yeah. Met in middle school, started dating in high school.
He's not like he's in shock. He's understanding everything we have to say, but he's just not showing any emotion, no anger, no sorrow. It's just not right.
You left Yakima about 08:30 on Saturday and drove down to the Tri-Cities. And you were there all day at the funeral with your family. Then you stayed at your dad's in Kennewick?
No, I actually stayed with a friend, but let's see.
What's the friend's name?
Oh, her name's Paige. She's a mutual friend.
What time do you think you arrived at Paige's house?
I'd say 12:30-ish. She had already went and laid down, so I had to go wake her butt up.
Did Desiree know that you were going to Paige's?
I don't know, honestly.
It's not something you had discussed with her?
No. No, Paige would come stay with us. We'd stay with her.
Was it just a platonic friendship, or did you have an actual relationship with Paige?
You know, I shouldn't go there because it's kind of rude, but well, Des didn't want me to say anything to anybody, but at one point, her and Paige had a little thing going for a while there, a little experiment.
Okay, so it was Desiree and Paige who had the sexual relationship?
Yeah.
But not you and Paige? Or
we all did.
Sometimes you and Paige too?
Honestly, we all did.
We're in the beginning of this investigation. As we learn more and more, we were finding out there was some type of a love triangle. Paige Blades was a 23-year-old mistress to Scott Sunford.
So it sounds like you and Desiree had a pretty open relationship.
Generally, no.
No?
Generally, no. Just with her.
Just with her. There was a special relationship with Paige?
Yeah.
So you don't think it would not have bothered Desiree to know that you were going to stay with Paige?
No. And honestly, we didn't even do anything. I was out on the couch anyways, because
we felt that we were not getting the full story. It's a relationship between a mistress and a gentleman, and that his wife is dead. Okay, how much is he involved, or how much she involved, or are they both involved?
So we can about wrap it up here. It's 3:32 hours on April 8th, 2013.
The team drove to interview Paige and to get any type of background she could tell us about her relationship with Scott and the activities from that weekend.
I understand that you're a friend of Scott and Desiree.
Yeah. I met Scott in February 2011, and we became friends. I met his wife, Desiree, in May of the same year.
She was very cooperative, very forthright, didn't seem to be concerned about us knowing about her relationship with Scott.
So you were involved in a sexual relationship with Scott, and Desiree knew about it?
I was also sexual with her as well.
When was the last time that you saw Scott?
Saturday. He came, we had a funeral in Tri-Cities.
be real honest with you, your story seems almost too clean and perhaps coached from Scott, because your stories match too well.
If you know anything regarding this death, and you're trying to make up a story or protect Scott, the truth is going to come out eventually.
Paige Blades became a person of interest after the interview. The crime lab determined that the shoe sizes were between a 12 and a 14, man's size, and also Dr. Soul's tread. We did look at a number of shoes that we found in the Sunford residence, and none of those matched the type of shoe and the size in the print that it would leave. We still felt that Scott was involved, but without any physical or hard evidence, it's going to be hard to put him at the crime scene. So we started collecting cell phone data and as much information on Scott that we could find. We suspected that Paige maybe was giving him an alibi, that he maybe was not there that evening, but his phone was not anywhere near the residence at the time of the homicide. Even though he's still our #1 person of interest, it just wasn't connecting him to the crime at the time. We looked at all sorts of the relationship, financial, personal, relationships, friends, neighbors. We were coming up with nothing that would indicate there was a major problem in the marriage to a point where someone would be killed.
What I want for Christmas is an end to this nightmare.
That was Connie Cass' Christmas wish last year. Her daughter dead, her daughter's murderer nowhere to be found.
Somebody out there knows something.
A tip came through the local Crime Stoppers telephone network, and the person told us that the name of the shooter was a Marty Grismer, and that he had killed Desiree Sunford. We had not heard that name anywhere in the investigation. We needed to confirm how this person that was calling us knew about this stuff, and it turned out that it was Paige Blades' phone number. If she knew this information, why didn't she call us directly? Things are just not adding up.
This blue house on North St. Hilaire Road turned from a married couple's home into a crime scene. And now an empty reminder of the murder of Desiree Sunford.
Desiree was a wonderful young woman. She had a lot to look forward to. She was so kind to everyone and openly warm that this world needed her.
Hi, Paige.
Hi.
Long time no see.
Long time.
We're trying to get Paige to open up. We're trying to help get this weight off her shoulders.
Did a little research based on the information that you sent us, and found a picture of Marty Grismer. Is that the gentleman that we're talking about?
Paige told us that Marty is a friend of hers, that they work together, and he kind of takes care of her.
Marty was my best friend. Marty and I started dating for a little bit until he found out about Scott, and I told him I couldn't see him anymore. He's the one that got me the house. He bought my car outright with cash. He pays my insurance. He's done my grocery shopping. He's taken very well care of me.
At one point, I believe she told us that he just worshiped the ground she walks on, like he was obsessed with her.
So you told Marty that Scott was the father of the baby?
Oh, Marty knew that Scott and I were together, and Scott was the only one that I was seeing. And he's smart enough to put it together. I told him what was going on. And, he asked me if I wanted him to take care of this new woman like he did Des. And I asked him what he was talking about. And apparently, he decided that if the baby was Scott's like it was supposed to be, then Desiree would cause issues. Oh my God.
We were skeptical about what type of information she was providing. Is she throwing him under the bus, or is she directing it differently for us to follow?
Are there any other details that he gave you about the night of, about how he did it, or?
He went in the front door because he knew that that was the closest to the bedroom. The alarm went off when he opened the door. And Ada came out barking. Des came out right behind her, and he shot her. He shot her 3 times. She went down. He shot her some more. He went to the back of the house and moved the board off the window that Scott had put up.
What was your reaction when he started telling you all this?
I was in shock. I just mostly just sat and listened to him. So he used to get away with it.
What did you say to that?
I said, I already have.
We continued talking with Paige and see if we could get her to meet with Marty and get him to tell the same story again, how he killed Desiree, but this time it would be taped.
What if there was a situation where we could put a wire on you? Would you be willing to talk to him with a wire on?
If it means he goes to jail and this whole thing can be over, yeah.
It's getting more complicated as we go along. We're not sure, did Scott get a hold of Marty to kill his wife? Did Paige get a hold of Marty to kill Desiree so she could have Scott? Or did Marty just do this on his own?
Information coming out about the murder of Desiree Sunford might only scratch the surface of this case. Police believe Sunford's husband had a mistress.
Give me a minute of your time with nobody around. Because I know that you said that there was no evidence. So I'm just wondering for sure if there's nothing left.
What are you talking about? I don't have it. You haven't done anything.
You can't freak me out, put me in full-on panic mode, and then just be like, nope, I don't know what you're talking about.
I imagine why you're panicking.
Oh, yeah. Gee, I wonder. Right, because I haven't had any sort of... Confusing dreams with reality. Is that what happened? Absolutely.
Marty wouldn't cooperate. She tried to lead him a little bit without putting words in his mouth, but he seemed to be very nervous, very cautious in his conversation with her that day, and we did not get any information that was usable. The sheriff's office received a phone call from one of the other managers who was cleaning where Marty had his office and found a bag of gun parts. So our team immediately drove to Moses Lake, recovered the gun parts, and took them directly to the crime lab to have them examined. It was determined that this barrel was on the gun used to kill Desiree Sunford. The bullets that we recovered from her autopsy came from that barrel. We had evidence in our hands that gave us enough to arrest him on the spot, but we'd really like to have a confession. And so we started off with just a general conversation, how he knows Paige, how he knows Desiree, or does he know the Sunfords at all.
You mentioned that you have met Desiree Sunford once.
I met her in passing. I met Scott many times before that, but I never met his wife because we never had any functions or anything together.
Okay.
We're not going to drop the hammer on him right away. We're building up that relationship with him, try to get him to feel comfortable in talking with us, and see what he'll admit to.
I ran a report that shows me all the guns that are registered to you, and it says that you own a Glock 9mm.
Yes, I do.
You do? Okay. You still own that?
It's at my apartment in the back of my wife's van with a supply of ammunition.
He told us that he dealt with guns quite often, fixing them, repairing them, trading guns with other people. He was also telling us that he very rarely loans the guns or any of his parts to anybody. He always keeps them himself.
I'll be more than happy to turn the weapon over to you to do any tests or anything you can do.
We're trying to get him to open up. We're not giving him all the facts we have in our hand, but we want to see his reaction as we come up with these little nuggets, we call them.
What's your relationship with Paige?
It's been complicated over the years. I mean, she was the best man at my wedding. So, I mean, she was my best friend for a while there.
You said she was the best man at your wedding?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
She was my best friend, so I had to be my best man.
Okay, all right. That's a first.
Were you two involved in a sexual relationship at one time?
Not exactly, no. We just fooled around a bit on there early on, but I was taking care of things for her financially. Fixing up her house, fixing up her plumbing, finding a place to live, moving her butt in there. Moving stuff out of storages for her when the bills were running out on them. I tried to be there for her because I wanted a relationship with her. Like a moth to a flame, I kept going back and trying to help her, even after her own mother told me you probably shouldn't be her friend.
Did you ever offer to kill Desiree Sunford for Paige?
No, I haven't. I've never offered to kill anyone for anything. It's not my nature.
Have you ever discussed killing her with Paige?
No.
Did she ever ask you to kill Desiree Sunford?
No.
Did Scott ever ask you to kill Desiree Sunford?
No one's ever asked me to kill anyone. I wouldn't. I've never thrown a punch in anger in my life. I wouldn't kill anyone. It's not who I am.
Where the problem comes in, the difficulty for you is that Paige is saying that you are the one who shot and killed Desiree Sunford. She said that you confessed that to her. And she came in and gave a tape statement to that effect.
Can't believe that she's doing that. I mean,
the color just drained out of his face. I thought he was actually going to get sick.
Paige has put you smack in the middle of a murder investigation.
Just trying to put my life in. I mean,
this would be a good way to go about it.
Didn't kill anyone. Just pin the on me.
Marty, from the beginning of this conversation, as soon as you sat down, your heart's been about ready to jump out of your throat. You knew exactly what we wanted to talk to you about when you sat down.
I haven't done anything wrong on her and that, but she's trying to engineer, set me up here, do something saying to you that that killed someone, that it makes me sick.
We were confronting him with some pretty heavy information, and as he's thinking, his eyes are wandering around and he's trying to figure out what he's going to say next.
You work at Basic American Foods, and they said that you were suspended from work for having gun parts.
Yeah.
At work. Okay, tell me about that. What kind of gun parts are we talking about?
I had a gun barrel that I left there.
A gun barrel?
Yeah.
Okay. Where it gets even worse for you is this gun barrel that we've been talking about. That's the gun barrel that was in the gun that killed Desiree Sunford. I've already retrieved that gun barrel from Basic American Foods, and I've already had the ballistic analysis done on it. And the slugs that were pulled from Desiree's body came from that gun.
How?
Well, that's the big question. You had the barrel that the bullets came out of that killed her. There's no question. So we need the truth. And we need it now. Give it up.
I've had that barrel for a while on them. I did let Paige borrow the gun early last year. She had the gun, she had that barrel on there.
He's changing his story. He said he'd never loaned the gun out to anybody. Now he knows that the gun was used in the murder. He's got to find somebody that he gave the gun to, and Paige is the likely person.
I loaned the gun to her early last year. This was around February, on she had it for a while.
When did you get it back from her?
I got back about the end of March. I didn't know if anything had happened to all that. She asked me to try to get rid of stuff on.
End of March?
Yeah.
Of last year or this year?
2013. That was not March, sorry. May.
He asked him when he got the gun back, and he says March. He says that twice. And all of a sudden, he realized the murder happened in April. He's not thinking fast enough. Okay, he's got the dates wrong. Otherwise, he's the one with the gun at the time of the murder.
Do you wear Dr. Scholl's shoes?
I have previously on them. I was still at my dad's if I hadn't.
What size?
I've worn from a 12 to a 14 on there usually.
12 to 14? There were some bloody shoe prints left at the crime scene the night of the murder. What are the odds you think that those will match your size foot?
I don't know. I don't have shoes like that anymore. I had bought them previously on them, but I wasn't there. So they shouldn't match my feet. didn't kill anyone. I didn't go there.
If you know what happened, you just don't want to tell us everything. You're walking up to the edge, and we're asking you to go to the edge. Walk through the door. It's silent group, and you're refusing to do that. That's what we're seeing right now.
Is it possible that Paige recruited you into a scheme and then just threw you under the bus?
I guess I feel thrown under the bus, but I don't know.
We were hoping if there was any connection between Scott's involvement or Paige's involvement in the death of Desiree, that Marty wouldn't go alone. I mean, why take the rap by yourself?
You know exactly what happened, Marty. You know exactly what happened.
How would I know exactly what happened?
Because you're involved up to your eyeballs in this case. All the evidence is on your shoulder right now.
Yakima County deputies say the murder investigation took a turn last month when a man called to say he found gun parts in the office of a former worker. That worker was Marty Grismer.
We know that that barrel was used in the murder. Okay? And we both strongly believe that you're involved in that murder. Very strongly, we believe that.
I never killed anyone.
But you know who killed her.
Were you present?
No. I was not there. I was at home. I don't know who did it. I thought Paige had done it. That's how I thought. Well, I thought that Scott had done it, but I don't know.
You can see that he's getting really antsy. Color in his face is draining. That's something you don't have any control over. He's showing us enough body language that he's lying. We're still thinking Paige is involved somehow, and he's not doing this all by himself.
After everything you've done for her, after all the money, blood, sweat, tears, and love that you gave to her, and she turned around and you over.
I know.
We have you.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to jail. So you can protect Paige all you want.
I didn't kill anyone.
But you're going to jail.
What are you going to arrest me for?
First degree murder.
The interview lasted a little over 2 hours. We're getting to a point where there's nothing else we could push him with, and so the interview was terminated and he was taken into custody and brought back to Yakima.
This case was set to go to a jury trial, but the state offered a plea deal to Grismer at the last minute due to uncertainty in some of their witnesses.
An Alford plea is he's not admitting to the crime, he's not confessing to the crime, he's just saying that the state, which would be the prosecution, has enough evidence to get a conviction.
A Yakima Superior Court judge accepted a plea to send Marty Grismer to prison for killing Wapato art teacher Desiree Sunford in 2013. Desiree's mother, Connie Cast, spoke at the sentencing and asked the judge to send Grismer away for a long time.
People, they tell me they know how I feel. You have no idea how I feel. I don't want you to know how I feel, because no one should have to deal with this type of pain.
Court is going to go along with the resolution in this case. I will sentence you to a term of 15 years with the State Department of Corrections. If I had the authority, I would make sure that you went to the harshest prison in the state of Washington.
Desiree wasn't any type of a threat. You would think if Marty wanted Paige all to himself, just eliminate Scott. It just didn't make sense. There's got to be other reasons than just he did this all on his own for his love for Paige.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not what you know, it's what you can prove. These cases will follow a detective, a deputy, a police officer for the rest of their lives. There's a lot of relief that comes along with solving them because, you know, we want justice for the families.
Desiree's mother passed away a few years later, but we were able to let her know that we caught her daughter's killer and that he was sentenced to prison.
There are cases that disappear with time. And then there are cases that refuse to die. For more than 4 decades, 2 names remained buried beneath the silence of Mississippi. Charles Eddie Moore, Henry Hezekiah D. Both were 19 years old. Both disappeared on May 2, 1964. And for years, the truth about what happened to them remained hidden behind fear, silence, and a community that had learned to live with unanswered questions. But somewhere inside that silence was another name. James Ford Seal. A former member of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. A man who would eventually stand before a federal jury more than 40 years after the 2 young men vanished. By then, the country had changed. The civil rights movement had transformed American history. Laws had changed. Institutions had changed. Generations had grown older. But the memory of 2 19-year-old men disappearing into the Mississippi night had never completely disappeared. And in 2007, the past finally came knocking. The story began in a place where racial violence was not an abstract idea. It was part of daily life. Mississippi in 1964 was at the center of the American civil rights struggle. African Americans were challenging segregation, discrimination, intimidation, and a system that had denied them basic rights for generations. The summer would become infamous. Freedom Summer was approaching. Civil rights workers were arriving. Communities were organizing. And across Mississippi, tensions were rising. But on May 2nd, before the nation would witness some of the most notorious violence of that era, 2 young black men were simply trying to live their lives. Charles Moore and Henry D. were 19. They were not famous politicians. They were not national activists, whose names appeared in newspapers every morning. They were young men from Mississippi. And that fact would become one of the most haunting elements of the case. Because their disappearance did not immediately produce the kind of national alarm that later surrounded other civil rights murders. There was no television camera following them. No national press corps waiting at the roadside. No army of investigators descending upon the area. Instead, there was a road. A vehicle. A group of men. And a decision that would change 2 families forever. According to evidence later presented in federal court, Moore and Dee were abducted by Seal and other Klansmen. The men were taken into the Homokito National Forest in Franklin County. There, the 2 19-year-olds were beaten. They were interrogated at gunpoint. They were restrained. And eventually, they were transported away from the forest. The journey would take them across state lines. That detail would become crucial decades later. At the time, however, the most important thing was simpler. 2 young men had vanished. And nobody knew where they were. The forest was vast. The night could conceal almost anything. And in 1964, there were few tools available to reconstruct what had happened once witnesses disappeared and evidence began to decay. The men who allegedly carried out the crime had every reason to believe that time would protect them. They were wrong. But it would take more than 40 years for the consequences to arrive. The case became even more disturbing because of what happened after the disappearance. Investigators eventually connected the missing men to the Mississippi River. The victims were taken to an area known as Parker's Landing in Warren County. Evidence presented decades later established that the perpetrators attached heavy objects to the young men before throwing them into the old Mississippi River. The river became the final hiding place. 2 bodies went beneath the surface. 2 families were left without answers. And Mississippi continued moving forward. Months passed. Then the remains were discovered. They were badly decomposed. The identities and circumstances surrounding the deaths became part of a larger investigation during one of the most turbulent periods in American history. But finding the bodies was not the same as finding justice. The people responsible were not immediately brought into a courtroom. There was no swift prosecution. No dramatic arrest. No confession that suddenly explained everything. Instead, the case slipped into the enormous archive of American cold cases. And that is where it remained. 4 years. Then decades. The names Charles Moore and Henry D. survived. Their families remembered. Some investigators remembered. Some journalists remembered. And eventually, the federal government began revisiting old civil rights-era crimes that had never been properly resolved. The question was no longer whether America had changed. The question was whether the law could reach backward through time and hold someone accountable for a crime committed in 1964. That question would become the center of James Ford Seal's case. Because by the time investigators returned to the evidence, the country was almost unrecognizable compared with the Mississippi of 1964. The technology was different. The investigators were different. The witnesses were older. Some were dead. Some memories had faded. And some people had spent decades carrying secrets that had never been spoken aloud. Yet the old case still contained something prosecutors believed could be used. Evidence, testimony, and a surviving participant willing to tell investigators what he knew. The reopened investigation would eventually focus on Seal. He had been associated with the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. The organization was part of the violent white supremacist network operating in Mississippi during the civil rights era. But decades had passed since the night Moore and Dee disappeared. Seal had lived an ordinary life for years after the crime. That fact alone was difficult to comprehend. While the families of the 2 young men carried the loss, the man prosecutors would eventually accuse of participating in their abduction remained free. 40 years became 41. 41 became 42. The calendar continued turning. The photographs aged. Parents became grandparents. Friends grew old. And the 2 19-year-olds remained forever 19. Then the investigation moved again. The Department of Justice and federal investigators reopened the case. The government examined evidence from the original investigation. Investigators revisited witnesses. They reconstructed the movements of the victims. They examined the connection between the kidnapping and the interstate journey. And they searched for the legal path that could finally bring the case into federal court. This was not going to be simple. A prosecution more than 4 decades after a crime is a race against time. Witnesses disappear. Memories become uncertain. Documents are lost. Physical evidence deteriorates. And the defense can argue that the government waited too long. That argument would eventually become one of the central legal battles surrounding Seal. But before the courtroom arguments, before the lawyers, before the appeals, there was the evidence of what happened to two 19-year-old men. The government alleged that Seal and his fellow Klansmen abducted Moore and D. because they believed D might possess information concerning African Americans importing firearms into Franklin County. The motive described in the indictment was rooted in the racial and political atmosphere of Mississippi during that era. The victims were taken. They were interrogated. They were beaten. They were transported. And ultimately, according to the evidence presented at trial, they were drowned. The brutality of the allegations was matched by the passage of time. 43 years separated the crime from Seal's arrest. By then, the men who once believed they could bury the evidence had grown old. But the victims had never been forgotten. In January 2007, the federal government unsealed an indictment charging Seal with 2 counts of kidnapping and 1 count of conspiracy. The news sent the old case back into public view. A crime from 1964 had suddenly become a federal prosecution in the 21st century. The past had returned. Seal was no longer simply a name in an old investigative file. He was a defendant. And for the families of Moore and D., that moment carried a meaning that could not be measured by a courtroom calendar. For decades, there had been no verdict. No sentence. No definitive legal judgment against the man prosecutors accused of helping take their loved ones. Now there would be a trial. The government would have to prove its case. The defense would fight the charges. And the jury would have to confront evidence that reached back to a time when Mississippi was consumed by racial conflict. The courtroom would become the place where a 43-year-old mystery would finally be forced into the light. But there was another question hanging over the prosecution. Could the government legally prosecute a crime this old? Seal's lawyers would argue that the answer was no. The passage of time was not merely a background detail. It was going to become a weapon. Because the United States had laws governing when criminal charges could be brought. And Seal's defense would argue that changes to the federal kidnapping statute had created a statute of limitations problem. If the case was too old to prosecute, then the evidence would never reach a final verdict. The victims could remain symbols of an unsolved era. The families could remain without closure. And the accused could walk away. The government disagreed. Federal prosecutors argued that the kidnapping statute applicable to the case allowed the prosecution to proceed. The issue would eventually climb through the federal appellate system. But first, the case had to survive the trial itself. And on June 14, 2007, after hearing the evidence, a federal jury in Mississippi found James Ford Seal guilty. The verdict was more than a legal conclusion. It was the culmination of a decades-long effort to reopen one of the darkest chapters of Mississippi's civil rights era. Seal was convicted of 2 counts of kidnapping and 1 count of conspiracy. The man accused of helping abduct 2 19-year-olds in 1964 was now a convicted federal criminal. But the case was not over. Not even close. Because the defense appealed. And the legal battle that followed would test whether the conviction could survive the passage of time. The first appellate ruling went against the government. In September 2008, a 3-judge panel of the Fifth Circuit initially reversed the convictions on statute of limitations grounds. For a moment, the case appeared to be collapsing. After decades of waiting, after the indictment, after the trial, after the verdict, the conviction itself was suddenly in danger. But prosecutors did not stop. The United States sought rehearing before the full Fifth Circuit. The court later upheld the trial court's refusal to dismiss the indictment, and the case continued through further appellate proceedings. In March 2010, the Fifth Circuit ultimately affirmed Seal's conviction and sentence. The Supreme Court later denied his petition for review. The legal door had closed. The verdict remained. The sentence remained. 3 life terms. And the man, who had lived free for decades, would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. James Ford Seal died in prison on August 2, 2011. He was no longer a free man. The case that had begun with 2 19-year-olds disappearing in Mississippi had ended with a conviction that survived decades of silence and years of legal challenges. But there is something unsettling about this story. Justice arrived. Yet it arrived impossibly late. Charles Moore and Henry D. never saw it. They never heard the verdict. They never watched Seal enter a courtroom. They never knew that 43 years after their disappearance, the country would finally hear their names again. That is the paradox of a cold case. The law may eventually catch up with the accused. But it can never reverse time for the dead. It cannot return 2 19-year-olds to their families. It cannot restore the years that disappeared while the case remained dormant. And it cannot erase the fear that allowed the crime to remain hidden for so long. What it can do is something smaller, but important. It can place a name beside an accusation. It can place evidence before a jury. It can create a record. It can establish responsibility in a court of law. And sometimes, decades after a crime has been buried, that record becomes the only answer history has left. The story of James Ford Seal is therefore not simply the story of a man who was finally convicted. It is the story of 2 young men whose lives ended in a river. It is the story of families who waited. It is the story of investigators who returned to evidence others had left behind. And it is the story of a country forced to confront crimes committed during one of the most violent and consequential periods of its history. The Mississippi River kept its secret for months. The legal system kept the case unresolved for decades. But the names Charles Moore and Henry D. survived. And eventually, so did the evidence. 43 years after the disappearance, the silence was broken. A federal jury spoke. An appellate court spoke. And for the first time, the historical record contained a final judgment against the man who had spent decades outside a prison cell. But the river remained. The forest remained. The old roads remained. And somewhere in the history of Mississippi, there remained the question that no verdict could completely erase. How many other stories like this one had disappeared into the silence? How many victims never received a courtroom? How many witnesses carried secrets to their graves? How many families waited for a phone call that never came? The Seal case proved that time could make justice harder. It did not necessarily make justice impossible. And that may be the most haunting part of all. Because in a cold case, the silence can last for years. Sometimes decades. But silence is not the same thing as disappearance. The evidence may be buried. The witnesses may grow old. The headlines may fade. But somewhere, in an old file, an archived photograph, a forgotten testimony, or a memory that someone finally decides to reveal, the past can still be waiting. For Charles Moore and Henry D., the past waited 43 years before it finally reached a courtroom. And even then, justice could only do what justice does. It could tell the world what the jury found. It could impose a sentence. It could preserve the truth in the public record. But it could never give 2 19-year-old men another tomorrow. That is why their names remain at the center of this case. Not James Ford Seal. Not the courtroom. Not the appeals. Not even the decades of legal arguments. The center of this story is Charles Moore and Henry D. Two young men, 19 years old, taken from the world in May 1964. Remembered long after the people who expected their deaths to be forgotten had grown old. And finally, after more than 4 decades of silence, their case became one of the most significant civil rights era, cold case prosecutions in modern American history. The river could hide the bodies. Time could bury the evidence. Fear could silence witnesses. But it could not erase their names. And it could not keep the truth buried forever. For more than 40 years, the silence surrounding Charles Moore and Henry D. seemed almost permanent. But silence has a weakness. It depends on everyone remaining silent. And in the James Ford Seal case, one man eventually broke that silence. His name was Tommy Lee Edwards. Edwards had been connected to the same violent world that investigators were now trying to reconstruct. He had been among the Klansmen involved in the events of May 2, 1964. But unlike Seal, Edwards would eventually cooperate with federal investigators. That decision would change the case completely. Because for decades, investigators had faced the same problem. The crime was old. The physical evidence was old. The witnesses were old. And many of the people who might have known exactly what happened were already dead. But Edwards was still alive. And he was willing to talk. His testimony would become one of the most important pieces of evidence presented against Seal. According to the federal court record, Edwards personally observed events surrounding the kidnapping. He described how Moore and Dee were taken. He described their transportation. He described the route. And, according to the appellate court, he later testified that Seal told him where and how the 2 young men had been killed. That testimony did not stand alone. The government presented other evidence that prosecutors argued corroborated Edwards's account. But the importance of Edwards was difficult to overstate. For decades, the case had been trapped inside the past. Now someone from that past was speaking directly to investigators. The silence had cracked. And once it cracked, the old story began moving rapidly. The federal government had already begun placing greater emphasis on unresolved civil rights era crimes. The cases were decades old, but their historical significance had not disappeared. Some had ended without convictions. Others had never produced an arrest. Some investigations had simply stopped. The passage of time had protected people who might otherwise have faced prosecution. But the Department of Justice began looking again. Old FBI files were reopened. Names were compared. Witnesses were located. Evidence was re-evaluated. And the murder of Charles Moore and Henry D. emerged once again. The investigation was formally reopened in 2006. That was more than 40 years after the 2 teenagers disappeared. The world that investigators entered was very different from the one that had existed in 1964. The investigators were not chasing men in their 20s. They were dealing with aging suspects. Aging witnesses. Aging memories. And an enormous historical gap. But the gap itself became part of the story. Because the question was no longer simply, who killed these 2 young men? The question was, can the government still prosecute someone for a crime committed 43 years ago? That distinction would become critical. The government believed it could. Seal's defense would argue that it could not. Before that legal battle reached the appellate courts, however, prosecutors had to build the case. And the more they reconstructed the events of May 2, 1964, the more disturbing the alleged sequence became. Moore and Dee had been taken from a road. The men who seized them were not strangers acting randomly. According to the evidence presented at trial, Seal and other members of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan were involved. The young men were driven into the Homokito National Forest. The forest was isolated. It was the kind of place where violence could occur far from public view. There, according to the government's evidence, the victims were beaten and interrogated at gunpoint. The alleged purpose of the interrogation was itself rooted in the racial conflict of the time. Investigators said the Klansmen believed Henry D. might have information about African Americans importing firearms into Franklin County. That belief became part of the prosecution's explanation for why Dee and Moore were targeted. But the violence did not end in the forest. The two men were bound with duct tape. They were placed into a vehicle. Then the vehicle left Mississippi. That interstate movement would eventually provide the federal government with a crucial legal basis for prosecution. The route passed through Louisiana. Then the group returned toward Mississippi. The destination was Parker's Landing in Warren County. There, the evidence presented at trial described an even more chilling sequence. The victims were taken toward the old Mississippi River. Heavy objects were attached to them. They were placed in a boat. And then, according to the government's case, they were thrown into the river alive. There was no dramatic gun battle. No public confrontation. No crowd of witnesses. Only water. Darkness. And two young men disappearing beneath the surface. For the people who committed the crime, investigators later argued, the river was supposed to be the final chapter. It was supposed to erase the evidence. It was supposed to make the victims disappear. But several months later, divers recovered the badly decomposed remains. The river had not kept its secret forever. Still, identifying the people responsible would prove much harder. The discovery of the bodies answered one question. It did not answer the most important one. Who had done it? And why had nobody been held accountable? Those questions remained for years. The civil rights era moved on. Mississippi changed. America changed. But the case remained attached to the past. Then, decades later, investigators returned. And suddenly, the people who had once believed the case was dead were confronted by something unexpected. Memory. Not perfect memory. Not complete memory. But enough memory to reopen the investigation. Edwards's testimony gave prosecutors a direct connection between Seal and the alleged kidnapping. The defense would attack that testimony. And that was inevitable. A courtroom more than 4 decades after a crime is a battlefield over memory. How accurately can anyone remember a night from 1964? How much has been altered by time? How much was forgotten? How much was reconstructed later? And how much of what a witness says can be confirmed by independent evidence? These questions would follow the case all the way to the appellate courts. But prosecutors had more than a witness. They had the history of the two victims. They had the circumstances of their disappearance. They had the discovery of their remains. They had evidence concerning the route taken by the perpetrators. And they had a legal theory based on kidnapping. The case was therefore not presented to the jury as a murder prosecution alone. It was built around federal kidnapping charges and conspiracy. That distinction mattered. The government did not simply need to prove that 2 men had died. It needed to prove that Seal participated in the unlawful kidnapping and interstate transportation of the victims. That meant reconstructing the entire chain of events. The abduction. The interrogation. The beating. The restraint. The transportation. the crossing of state lines, and finally, the deaths. Every link mattered. If one critical link collapsed, the prosecution could be weakened. The defense understood that. And the defense had another powerful argument. Time. 43 years. That was an enormous gap between crime and indictment. The statute of limitations would become the central legal weapon. At the time, federal law generally imposed a 5-year limitation period for non-capital offenses. Seal's lawyers argued that the government had waited far too long. The alleged kidnappings had happened in 1964. The indictment did not arrive until January 2007. The difference was not 5 years. It was more than 8 times that length. It was 43 years. The defense argued that the prosecution was therefore legally barred. The issue reached the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And in September 2008, a 3-judge panel initially agreed with Seal. The court reversed his convictions on statute of limitations grounds. For the families of Moore and Dee, the decision must have felt like history repeating itself. After decades of waiting, the conviction appeared to be disappearing. The courtroom had finally spoken. And then the law seemed ready to take the verdict away. But prosecutors refused to let the case end there. They sought rehearing before the full Fifth Circuit. The legal fight became even larger. Now the question was no longer only what happened to 2 teenagers in 1964. It was whether a federal prosecution brought more than 4 decades later was legally permissible. The case became a battle between 2 principles. One principle was finality. The law generally does not allow prosecutors unlimited time to bring charges. The passage of time can make a fair trial harder. Witnesses disappear. Evidence disappears. Memories deteriorate. The other principle was accountability. A crime should not become immune from prosecution simply because the accused successfully avoided justice for decades. The government argued that the kidnapping statute in effect at the relevant time provided a legal basis for prosecution. The issue was complicated. And it would not be resolved in a single courtroom. In June 2009, the full Fifth Circuit considered the statute of limitations question. The court was evenly divided. That meant the district court's decision to deny Seal's motion to dismiss the indictment was affirmed. The prosecution survived. But the appellate battle was not finished. The remaining issues still had to be resolved. And that meant Seal's lawyers continued fighting. They challenged the sufficiency of the evidence. They challenged the government's case. They challenged the testimony. They challenged the legal foundation of the convictions. The government responded by defending the evidence presented at trial. The case returned to the original appellate panel. And the judges examined the record. One issue became especially important. Edwards's testimony. Could the jury legally rely on it? Was it sufficiently credible? Was it corroborated? Could a conviction rest on evidence from a witness whose memories reached back more than 40 years? The appellate court examined those questions. And its conclusion was devastating for Seal. The court found that Edwards's testimony was not legally incredible. The testimony about Seal's involvement in the kidnapping and the route taken by the victims was supported by other evidence. Taken together, the evidence was sufficient for a reasonable jury to conclude that Seal had participated in the conspiracy to kidnap Moore and Dee and transport them in interstate commerce. The conviction survived. The verdict remained. But there was still something deeply unsettling about the case. Seal had lived as a free man for 43 years. 43 years. Think about what that means. A 19-year-old disappears in 1964. The case becomes a cold case. The victim's family grows older. The country moves through war, political upheaval, economic crises, technological revolutions, and entire generations of social change. And somewhere inside that changing country, the man prosecutors would eventually accuse continues living his life. For 4 decades, there was no prison cell waiting for him. No federal sentence. No courtroom. No verdict. Just time. Then one morning, decades after the crime, federal agents came for him. The past had finally arrived at his door. But even after his conviction, the story remained complicated. Because a courtroom verdict cannot recreate the night of May 2, 1964. It cannot show exactly what Moore and Dee saw in their final moments. It cannot recover every word spoken in the forest. It cannot reconstruct every movement of the vehicle. It cannot restore every piece of evidence that disappeared during the decades when the case remained dormant. It can only examine what survived. And what survived was enough. Enough for an indictment. Enough for a trial. Enough for a conviction. Enough for 3 life sentences. The sentencing took place in August 2007. Seal received 3 life terms in federal prison. The man who had lived free for decades would now spend the remainder of his life behind bars. The sentence was final in one sense. But for the families, the meaning of the sentence was more complicated. Justice had arrived. But it had arrived after the victims were long gone. The men whose lives had been taken were still 19 in every photograph. Their families had aged. Their friends had aged. Their communities had changed. But Moore and Dee remained frozen in 1964. That is what time does to victims in cold cases. The world moves. They do not. Their final day remains fixed. Their final journey remains fixed. Their final age remains fixed. 19. And the case became a reminder that some crimes do not disappear simply because society becomes tired of remembering them. The names remain. The files remain. The questions remain. And sometimes, decades later, someone opens the file again. Someone asks another question. Someone makes another phone call. Someone finds another witness. And suddenly, a case everyone thought was dead begins breathing again. That is what happened in Mississippi. The river had not erased the story. Time had not erased it. And silence had not erased it. The story had simply been waiting. Waiting for a witness. Waiting for investigators willing to look again. Waiting for a legal argument strong enough to survive the passage of decades. Waiting for a courtroom. And waiting for the moment when the names Charles Moore and Henry Dee would once again appear in headlines across America. But before the final legal chapter could close, one question still remained. What exactly had allowed the truth to stay hidden for so long? Was it fear? Was it loyalty? Was it racial hatred? Was it the protection of a community that refused to speak? Or was it simply the power of time? Perhaps the answer was all of them. Because in a crime committed during an era of racial terror, silence can become more than silence. It can become protection. And when everyone who knows the truth understands what might happen if they speak, the truth can remain buried for generations. That was the world surrounding Charles Moore and Henry Dee. A world where 2 19-year-old men could vanish. A world where their bodies could be recovered from a river. A world where years could pass without a conviction. And a world where the people who knew what happened could grow old before anyone finally demanded answers. But the case had changed. The investigators were no longer looking at an unsolved disappearance from yesterday. They were looking at history. And history had finally begun to speak. The voice was imperfect. It was old. It was contested. It was challenged in court. But it was enough to bring James Ford Seal before a jury. And once that jury heard the story of May 2, 1964, the silence that had surrounded the case for so long could never be completely restored. Because a verdict had been entered. A sentence had been imposed. And the record would now remember what happened to Charles Moore and Henry D. Not as an unanswered rumor. Not merely as a forgotten tragedy. But as a case in which, more than 4 decades after 2 19-year-old men disappeared, the federal government finally secured a conviction. The clock had run for 43 years. Then it stopped. And for the first time, the man at the center of the prosecution was no longer protected by the distance of history. He was a prisoner. But the question of justice was not finished. Because there is a difference between convicting one man and understanding an entire era. And the story of Charles Moore and Henry D. was always larger than James Ford Seal. It was about what happened when hatred became organized. When violence became routine. When fear became a weapon. And when the passage of time seemed to promise that nobody would ever be held responsible. The conviction proved one thing. Time could delay justice. It could complicate justice. It could make justice extraordinarily difficult. But it could not guarantee that justice would never come. And that was the lesson left behind by a case that had waited more than 4 decades for its day in court. The river had carried the bodies away. The years had carried witnesses away. But the names remained. Charles Moore. Henry D. 19 years old. And finally, after 43 years, the silence surrounding their deaths had a verdict. The verdict had been delivered. But a verdict does not erase a mystery. It does not rewind a clock. And it does not answer every question left behind by a crime that has survived for decades. For Charles Moore and Henry D., the most important questions had existed long before James Ford Seal ever entered a federal courtroom. What happened on that road in Mississippi? Why were 2 19-year-old men singled out? Who was involved? And why did it take so long for the truth to emerge? To understand the case, investigators had to return to the beginning. Not 2007. Not 2006. Not even the year when the bodies were recovered. They had to return to 1964. Mississippi. A state standing at the center of the American civil rights struggle. A place where racial segregation was not simply a social custom. It was enforced through institutions, intimidation, and violence. The summer of 1964 would become known around the world as the Year of Freedom Summer. Civil rights organizations were preparing a massive voter registration campaign. Volunteers were arriving from across the country. Black Mississippians were challenging a system designed to prevent them from voting. And white supremacist organizations were determined to stop them. The atmosphere was combustible. The Ku Klux Klan was not merely a historical symbol. In Mississippi, during that era, it remained an active force. The White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan had developed a reputation for secrecy and violence. Members operated in the shadows. Meetings were concealed. Identities were protected. And fear was part of the strategy. Against that background, the disappearance of 2 black teenagers could easily become another case buried beneath the larger violence of the era. But Charles Eddie Moore and Henry Hezekiah D. were real people. They had families. They had friends. They had plans. They were 19. And on May 2, 1964, their lives were abruptly interrupted. The exact circumstances of their initial encounter with the men who abducted them would become one of the most important pieces of the later prosecution. The government alleged that Seal and other Klansmen were involved in the abduction. The men were taken toward the Homokito National Forest. The location mattered. Deep inside the forest, away from ordinary traffic and public view, the victims could be isolated. The prosecution presented evidence that the men were beaten and questioned. The interrogation was not an ordinary conversation. According to the government's case, the young men were treated as suspects in a world where racial paranoia had turned ordinary black political activity into a perceived threat. The alleged objective was information. The suspected information concerned firearms and African Americans in the area. But the interrogation escalated. The two teenagers were not released. They were restrained. They were taken away. And the road continued. At some point, the journey crossed from Mississippi into Louisiana. That interstate movement became central to the federal government's prosecution. The United States Constitution gives the federal government authority over certain interstate crimes. The kidnapping statute used by prosecutors therefore mattered enormously. This was not merely a Mississippi murder case. It was presented as a federal kidnapping conspiracy involving interstate transportation. That legal distinction would eventually determine whether Seal could be prosecuted at all. But in 1964, nobody at the center of the crime was thinking about federal jurisdiction. They were thinking about getting away with it. The victims were eventually brought back into Mississippi. They were taken toward the Mississippi River. And there, according to the evidence presented decades later, the final stage of the crime unfolded. The river was enormous, dark, powerful, unforgiving. It cut through the landscape like a natural barrier. A place where a body could disappear. A place where evidence could be carried away. According to testimony presented at trial, heavy objects were attached to the victims. The men were taken onto the river. Then they were thrown into the water. The river swallowed them. For the perpetrators, the calculation may have been simple. If the bodies were never found, the victims might never be identified. If the victims could not be identified, there would be no murder case. And if there was no murder case, there would be no trial. But the Mississippi River did not cooperate. The bodies eventually surfaced. Their condition made identification difficult. Yet investigators continued working. The discovery of the remains transformed the case from a missing person investigation into a homicide investigation. But even then, the path to justice remained blocked. Investigators needed suspects. And suspects needed evidence. The atmosphere surrounding the case made that extraordinarily difficult. The men who might know what had happened were not necessarily willing to talk. Some may have feared retaliation. Some had ideological reasons to remain silent. Others simply disappeared into ordinary life. Years passed. The civil rights movement transformed the nation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 became law. The Voting Rights Act followed. Segregation was challenged. Political power shifted. Mississippi changed. But the case of Moore and Dee did not receive the justice their families expected. Instead, their names became part of a much larger history. They were two of the many people whose deaths occurred during a period of racial violence. And the sheer number of cases made it easier for individual stories to disappear. That is one of the cruelest realities of historical violence. When there are too many victims, even a single life can become a footnote. But Moore and Dee were not footnotes to their families. They were sons. brothers, friends, young men who should have been preparing for adulthood. Instead, their families were left with questions. Questions that did not become easier with age. They became heavier. Imagine waiting for decades, while knowing that the people responsible might still be alive. Imagine seeing the country transform, while your family's story remains trapped in the same year. 1964. Imagine hearing about new civil rights laws. New presidents. New generations. New technology. New wars. New political movements. And knowing that somewhere in all of that history, your loved one had been taken and killed. That is what makes cold cases different. The passage of time does not necessarily reduce the pain. Sometimes it makes the injustice more visible. In the beginning, there is shock. Then there is grief. Then uncertainty. Then years of waiting. Eventually, waiting itself becomes part of the family's life. And in the Moore and D case, the wait became extraordinary. 4 decades. 4 decades, during which the country repeatedly confronted the legacy of racial violence. 4 decades, during which the identities of those responsible remained largely outside a courtroom. Then came the investigation that changed everything. Federal authorities reopened the case in 2006. It was not simply a matter of opening an old file. Investigators had to determine whether evidence could still support a prosecution. They had to locate surviving witnesses. They had to establish what had happened. They had to determine who had participated. And they had to overcome the legal obstacles created by the passage of time. The investigation eventually focused on Seal. He had been associated with the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. He was no longer a young Klansman operating in the shadows. He was an older man. But the government alleged that his role in 1964 had never disappeared. It had only been hidden. Then investigators found the witness, who could potentially connect him to the crime. Tommy Lee Edwards. Edwards was not an outsider. He had been connected to the events. And his testimony gave prosecutors something they had lacked for decades. A direct account from someone who had been there. But that also made Edwards vulnerable to attack. Defense lawyers could question his memory. They could question his credibility. They could point to the extraordinary passage of time. They could ask why he had waited. Why speak now? Why not then? Why should a jury trust a memory that stretched back more than 40 years? Those questions would become central at trial. But the prosecution had a response. The testimony was not presented in isolation. The government argued that other evidence supported Edwards's account. The physical discovery of the bodies was consistent with the broad narrative. The interstate movement was supported. The identities and activities of the defendants were supported by historical evidence. And the jury would ultimately decide whether the entire picture made sense. The trial opened in 2007. The courtroom became a place where 1964 and 2007 collided. The prosecution described a crime born in the violence of the civil rights era. The defense challenged the government's interpretation. Witnesses spoke about events that had happened when many of the jurors had not even been alive. Evidence from a different generation was placed before a modern jury. Photographs, records, testimony, names, places, dates. The case demanded that jurors travel backward in time. They had to imagine Mississippi as it had been more than 40 years earlier. They had to understand the fear surrounding black political activity. They had to understand the presence of armed white supremacist groups. They had to understand how 2 teenagers, could be abducted and transported without an immediate national outcry. And above all, they had to decide whether the evidence proved Seal's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution did not have the luxury of a fresh crime scene. There were no modern forensic techniques waiting to produce a decisive DNA match. There was no digital trail. No cell phone record. No surveillance camera. No GPS data. No internet search history. The case had to be built from the evidence that survived. That meant testimony mattered. History mattered. Old records mattered. And human memory mattered. The defense attacked the prosecution's case aggressively. The age of the evidence was unavoidable. The legal system is designed around a fundamental principle. The accused has the right to confront the evidence against him. But how does that work when the evidence is more than 4 decades old? How do you reconstruct a conversation that supposedly happened in a forest in 1964? How do you establish the exact sequence of events when witnesses have lived entire lifetimes since then? How do you determine what a person remembered and what a person learned later? These questions are difficult in any case. In a cold case, they become enormous. But the jury heard the evidence. And after deliberation, the verdict came. Guilty. 2 counts of kidnapping. 1 count of conspiracy. The room had waited 43 years for that word. Guilty. It was only 1 word. But behind it stood decades of unanswered questions. The verdict did not bring Moore and Dee back. It did not return the years to their families. But it established a legal judgment. The jury had found that Seal participated in the crime. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms. For the first time since 1964, the case had reached its most consequential point. But Seal's legal team was not finished. The defense appealed. And the case moved into another courtroom. This time, the battle was not over what happened in the forest alone. It was about whether the government had waited too long. The statute of limitations became the central issue. Seal's attorneys argued that federal law barred prosecution. The indictment had come 43 years after the alleged crime. The government argued that the specific kidnapping statute and its amendments allowed the prosecution. The issue was technical. But its consequences were enormous. If the defense prevailed, the conviction could disappear. If the government prevailed, the verdict would remain. For the families, this was another moment of uncertainty. They had already waited decades. Now they were waiting on legal interpretation. A courtroom could decide whether the case would survive. And for several years, the appeals continued. In September 2008, a Fifth Circuit panel initially ruled in Seal's favor on the statute of limitations question. The conviction was reversed. For a moment, the 43-year journey toward justice seemed to be collapsing. But the government requested further review. The full Fifth Circuit considered the matter. The legal landscape shifted again. And eventually, the conviction survived. The appellate court concluded that the prosecution was not barred in the manner Seal's defense had argued. The case continued. Other challenges followed. But the conviction ultimately stood. The Supreme Court declined to review the case. There would be no new trial. No dismissal. No escape through another procedural argument. The verdict remained. 3 life sentences remained. And the man at the center of the prosecution remained in federal custody. Yet the story still had one final chapter. Because Seal was already an old man. The crime had occurred when he was young. The conviction came when he was elderly. And the sentence would consume the remaining years of his life. On August 2, 2011, James Ford Seal died in federal custody. The man who had once walked free through decades of American history died behind bars. The legal case was over. But the historical case was not. Because history does not end when a defendant dies. The questions remain. What allowed the crime to remain unresolved for so long? Why did witnesses remain silent? Why did the case not produce justice in 1964? And how many other civil rights-era crimes remained buried because the people responsible believed time would protect them? The Moore and Dee case became a symbol of a larger reckoning. For decades, America had remembered the civil rights movement through its famous names. Martin Luther King Jr., Medgar Evers, Freedom Riders, marches, speeches, landmark legislation. But beneath those famous stories were countless individuals whose lives were lost in violence. People whose names did not become national slogans. People whose families carried the burden privately. People whose cases remained unresolved. Charles Moore and Henry Dee belonged to that hidden history. Their deaths were not forgotten. But for decades, justice remained out of reach. The eventual conviction of Seal demonstrated something powerful. A cold case can survive the disappearance of its original investigators. It can survive the death of witnesses. It can survive political change. It can survive 4 decades of silence. But it cannot survive forever if someone is willing to reopen it. That is why the case matters. Not because a single conviction can repair the past. It cannot. Not because a prison sentence can erase 43 years. It cannot. The case matters because the record was finally changed. For decades, there had been a gap between what many people believed had happened and what the law had established. The trial closed that gap. The jury heard the evidence. The jury reached a verdict. And the verdict became part of the historical record. But there remains another uncomfortable truth. Justice delayed is not the same as justice restored. When Charles Moore and Henry Dee disappeared, they were 19. When Seal was convicted, the world had changed beyond recognition. The teenagers were still 19 in the photographs. The defendant was an elderly man. The investigators, who had worked the original case, were gone or retired. The witnesses had aged. The families had endured decades of absence. That is what 43 years looks like. It is not just a number. It is an entire human lifetime. A child could be born the day Moore and Dee disappeared. That child could grow up. Go to school. Get married. Have children. Watch those children grow. Retire. And still be alive when the courtroom finally heard the case. That is how long the truth waited. And that is why the case remains haunting. Because the most disturbing part is not simply that 2 young men were killed. It is that the world kept turning afterward. Cars continued along Mississippi roads. Businesses opened. Children went to school. People celebrated birthdays. Presidents changed. Laws changed. Generations changed. And beneath all of it was a case that had never truly gone away. The names remained. Charles Moore. Henry Dee. The river remained. The forest remained. And eventually, the evidence returned. When the federal government reopened the investigation, it was not bringing the victims back to life. It was doing something else. It was refusing to allow the passage of time to become an automatic excuse for forgetting. That may be the enduring significance of the case. A cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Sometimes it is simply a case waiting for the right moment. Waiting for someone to speak. Waiting for investigators to ask the right question. Waiting for a forgotten document to be read again. Waiting for a witness to decide that silence has lasted long enough. And when that moment comes, the past can suddenly become present. For James Ford Seal, that moment came in 2007. For Charles Moore and Henry D., it came too late. But it came. And once the verdict was entered, the story could no longer be described merely as an unsolved disappearance. The names of two 19-year-olds had finally been attached to a courtroom judgment. Their families finally had an answer to a question that had survived generations. Not every question. Not every detail. But the most important one. Someone was held responsible. And in the end, that is what the long road from 1964 to 2007 had been about. Not revenge. Not rewriting history. Not changing what happened. It was about forcing the past to answer. And after 43 years, the past finally did. But even after the verdict, one question refused to disappear. What did justice mean when it arrived 43 years late? The courtroom had produced an answer in law. But outside the courtroom, the past remained complicated. Charles Moore and Henry D. were still gone. Their families had still lost decades. And Mississippi still carried the scars of the world in which the two teenagers had disappeared. To understand why the case mattered so much, investigators and historians had to look beyond the defendant. They had to look at the system surrounding the crime. The fear. The secrecy. The organizations. The culture of intimidation. And the extraordinary difficulty of prosecuting crimes committed during a period when violence against Black Americans could occur with little immediate consequence. The disappearance of Moore and Dee did not happen in isolation. It occurred during a period when Mississippi was being transformed by the civil rights movement. Black citizens were demanding the right to vote. Students were challenging segregation. Activists were organizing. Federal authorities were becoming increasingly involved. And white supremacist organizations saw these developments as an existential threat. The White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan represented one of the most militant elements of that resistance. Their activities were secretive. Their members concealed identities. And their organization depended heavily on intimidation. That environment mattered, because the people who might have witnessed crimes were living inside it. Speaking could be dangerous. Naming names could be dangerous. Cooperating with federal investigators could be dangerous. And silence could become a survival mechanism. The passage of time then amplified the problem. A witness who was afraid in 1964 might remain silent in 1965. Then 1966. Then 1970. Then 1980. At some point, silence becomes habit. And after decades, it becomes history. That is how cold cases are created. Not always because investigators do not care. Sometimes because the circumstances surrounding the crime make investigation almost impossible. The Moore and Dee case carried that burden. When their bodies were discovered, investigators knew they had been killed. But knowing the victims were dead was only the beginning. The question was who had killed them. And whether anyone could prove it. The evidence had to survive. The witnesses had to survive. And the law had to remain available. For years, none of those conditions aligned. Then, slowly, they did. The federal government reopened the investigation. The old evidence was examined again. The history of the case was reconstructed. And investigators found a path toward prosecution. The path led to James Fort Seal. But the prosecution had to prove more than Seal's association with the Ku Klux Klan. Membership in an organization, even a violent one, was not enough. The government needed to establish his participation in the specific crime. That distinction became critical. The prosecution's case centered on the events of May 2, 1964. According to the evidence presented at trial, Seal and other men participated in abducting Moore and Dee. The victims were taken into the forest. They were beaten. They were interrogated. They were restrained. And they were transported. The government argued that Seal participated in this process. The witness testimony placed him inside the sequence of events. And the interstate movement of the victims provided the federal jurisdiction necessary for the kidnapping charges. The courtroom therefore became a reconstruction site. There was no modern crime scene. There was no fresh blood. No new fingerprints. No surveillance footage. Instead, prosecutors assembled a picture from fragments. A witness remembered. A document survived. A location remained. A historical record confirmed another detail. Piece by piece, the old night was reconstructed. The challenge was enormous. Memory is not a recording. It changes. It fades. It absorbs later information. It can become stronger in some places and weaker in others. The defense understood this. And Seal's attorneys used the passage of time to challenge the prosecution's witnesses. They asked questions that jurors could not ignore. Could someone really remember events from 1964 accurately in 2007? Could the testimony be trusted after 4 decades? Could the government prove participation beyond a reasonable doubt? And perhaps the most important question of all. Why had it taken so long? The answer was partly embedded in the history of Mississippi itself. The civil rights era was not a normal criminal environment. Violence was political. Intimidation was organized. And law enforcement institutions were not always perceived by black communities as reliable protectors. That historical reality shaped the investigation. It also shaped the memories of the people who lived through it. For the families of Moore and Dee, the passage of time could not be measured simply by years. It was measured by birthdays without their sons. Holidays without them. Family gatherings where empty spaces remained. Children who grew up without knowing the men their families remembered. Photographs that became more precious as the years passed. A 19-year-old face frozen in time. That is one of the cruelest features of a cold case. The victim never grows older. Everyone else does. The family ages. Friends age. Investigators age. Even suspects age. But the victim remains exactly as they were on the final day. For Moore and Dee, that meant 19 forever. Their families had to carry that image through decades of American history. The country that existed when they disappeared eventually became a different country. But grief does not automatically modernize. It remains personal. A mother still loses her son. A brother still loses his brother. A friend still remembers a voice. A photograph still shows the same young face. And every anniversary brings the same date back. May 2, 1964. That date became a permanent mark on the lives of those who knew them. The federal prosecution could not remove it. But it could change what followed the date. For decades, there had been no conviction. After 2007, there was one. That distinction mattered. It mattered legally. It mattered historically. And it mattered emotionally. Yet the prosecution was not without controversy. The defense argued that the government had violated the statute of limitations. The legal question was unusually complex, because federal kidnapping law had changed over time. The government relied on the law applicable to the alleged conduct and subsequent statutory developments. The defense argued that the government could not revive an expired prosecution through later amendments. This was not merely a technical dispute. If the defense prevailed, the conviction could be erased. If the government prevailed, the prosecution could stand. The Fifth Circuit's consideration of the issue became one of the most important parts of the case. The court examined the history of federal kidnapping law. It examined the relevant statutes. It considered constitutional principles. And it considered whether prosecution in 2007 violated the law that applied to the alleged offense. The judges were divided at one stage. That division reflected the unusual legal problem. The crime was old. The statute had changed. The defendant had lived for decades without prosecution. And the court had to determine whether the government's case could proceed. Eventually, the conviction survived. But the legal battle revealed something important. Cold cases do not simply depend on evidence. They depend on law. Evidence can exist and still be unusable. A witness can remember and still be challenged. A suspect can be identified and still avoid prosecution if the legal framework does not permit charges. In Seal's case, prosecutors managed to navigate those obstacles. The jury convicted him. The appellate courts ultimately upheld the conviction. And the Supreme Court declined further review. But the case had also revealed how fragile delayed justice can be. One legal ruling could have changed the outcome. One witness could have died before investigators found him. One document could have disappeared. One critical memory could have faded beyond usefulness. The case survived by narrow margins. That is why cold case investigations often feel like races against time. Time is not neutral. Time destroys. Time removes. Time weakens. And yet time can also reveal. People who once refused to speak can eventually reconsider. Old loyalties can weaken. Fear can diminish. Generations can change. A person who once believed silence was necessary may eventually decide that silence has become unbearable. That dynamic played an important role in the broader history of civil rights-era prosecutions. As the decades passed, more witnesses became willing to talk. Some did so because they were older. Some because the political environment had changed. Some because the people they feared were no longer powerful. And some because they believed the victims deserved to be remembered. In the Moore and Dee case, testimony eventually helped turn history into evidence. The transformation was extraordinary. A memory from 1964 became courtroom testimony in 2007. A road became evidence. A river became evidence. An old organization became part of the prosecution's historical context. And the identity of a former Klansman became the subject of a federal trial. The courtroom was modern. The evidence was old. The collision between those two worlds created the unique atmosphere surrounding the case. Jurors had to decide what had happened more than 4 decades earlier. They had to judge the credibility of witnesses whose memories were separated from the crime by an entire generation. And ultimately, they concluded that the evidence was sufficient. Guilty. That word changed the legal status of James Ford Seal. But it also changed the historical status of the Moore and Dee case. It was no longer simply an old unresolved crime. It became a documented federal prosecution. A conviction. A sentence. A judicial record. And a reminder that some crimes from the civil rights era could still reach a courtroom. The significance went beyond Mississippi. Across the United States, other cases from the same era remained unresolved. Families of victims had waited. Some had never received answers. Some suspects had died. Some evidence had disappeared. Some cases were impossible to prosecute. But the Seal prosecution demonstrated that the passage of decades did not automatically mean the end of the story. That mattered. Because history often creates a dangerous illusion. It can make the past seem finished. 1964 feels distant. Old photographs look faded. The clothing looks unfamiliar. The cars look primitive. The streets look different. The faces look younger. But crimes committed in that period were not committed by people living in a museum. They happened to real people. And those people had families who continued living long after the headlines disappeared. For Moore&D, the distance between 1964 and 2007 was 43 years. But emotionally, the distance was much shorter. The loss remained immediate. A mother could still remember her son. A brother could still remember his voice. A friend could still remember the last time he saw him. Time had not erased the victims. It had only made the world around them older. And that is why the eventual prosecution carried such weight. It told the families that their loved ones had not been forgotten. The case had survived. Their names had survived. And someone had finally been held legally responsible. Still, there was a final cruelty. The person convicted was not the only person who had been connected to the events. The investigation had identified multiple participants and potential witnesses. But only one defendant would ultimately face the full federal prosecution, resulting in conviction. That left the broader story incomplete. A conviction answers one question. It does not necessarily answer every question. Who knew? Who remained silent? Who helped? Who looked away? Who could have spoken earlier? And what would have happened if the investigation had been reopened 20 years sooner? Those questions may never receive complete answers. The people who knew the most may have died. Documents may have vanished. Memories may have become unreliable. And the passage of time cannot be reversed. That is the permanent limitation of cold case justice. It can establish responsibility. It can preserve evidence. It can create a historical record. But it cannot recover everything. The Moore&D case therefore remains both a prosecution and a warning. It shows what justice can accomplish after decades. And it shows what decades can take away from justice. Every year matters. Every witness matters. Every piece of evidence matters. Because once a case is allowed to age beyond a generation, the investigation becomes an archaeological excavation of memory. Investigators are no longer collecting fresh evidence. They are recovering fragments. And sometimes, those fragments are all that remain. In this case, the fragments were enough. Enough to identify Seal. Enough to bring charges. Enough to convince a jury. Enough to survive appeal. But not enough to tell every detail of what happened that night. There would always be missing pieces. And perhaps that is why the story continues to haunt. The case ended. But the night never became completely transparent. There are still places where the evidence becomes uncertain. There are still moments where investigators can only reconstruct. There are still questions that cannot be answered with absolute certainty. And there are still two young men at the center of it. Charles Moore. Henry D. 19 years old. Their lives ended before they had a chance to become the people they might have been. No careers. No old age. No grandchildren they might have held. No ordinary future. Only photographs. Only memories. Only records. And eventually, a verdict. The verdict could not give them a future. But it could prevent the past from being completely rewritten by silence. That may be the most important legacy of the case. Because when a crime remains unsolved, uncertainty can become its own form of disappearance. The victim's story becomes fragmented. Rumor replaces evidence. Memory replaces history. And eventually, people who were not alive when the crime happened may wonder whether the story was ever true. A conviction changes that. It creates a permanent legal record. It says that the story was investigated. It says that evidence was presented. It says that a jury considered the evidence. And it says that a defendant was found guilty. For Charles Moore and Henry D., that record arrived decades too late. But it arrived. And for a case that had spent more than 40 years in the darkness, that mattered. Because some stories are buried. Some are forgotten. And some refuse to stay silent. The story of Moore and D belonged to the last category. It crossed generations. It crossed courtrooms. It crossed the changing landscape of American history. And eventually, it reached a verdict. But even after the verdict, the river remained. The forest remained. The old roads remained. And the memories remained. They were reminders that beneath the history books and famous speeches, there were individual lives. 2 19-year-old men. 2 families. 2 empty places at the table. And a case that waited more than 4 decades before the American justice system finally answered. The silence had been broken. But it had never been harmless. It had cost time. It had cost evidence. And most of all, it had cost 2 young men the possibility of ever seeing justice for themselves. They could only be represented by those who survived them. And those survivors had carried their names for decades. Until finally, the names entered a courtroom. Charles Moore. Henry D. And beside them, the name James Ford Seal. That was the moment when a forgotten chapter of Mississippi's past became a federal case again. And once that happened, there was no putting the history back into the dark. The history could no longer be pushed back into the dark. But the darkness surrounding the case had not disappeared. It had simply changed. Now it existed inside documents. Inside testimony. Inside court transcripts. Inside the memories of people who had carried the events of 1964 for more than 40 years. And as investigators reconstructed the case, one fact became increasingly difficult to ignore. The passage of time had not made the story less disturbing. It had made the story harder to prove. Every detail had to survive scrutiny. Every witness had to face questions. Every piece of evidence had to withstand the defense. Because in a federal courtroom, history is not enough. A jury does not convict because an era was violent. It convicts because the evidence establishes guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That was the burden facing prosecutors. They were not asking jurors to decide whether Mississippi had experienced racial violence. That fact was already part of history. They were asking jurors to decide whether James Ford Seal had personally participated in the kidnapping conspiracy that took Moore and D from the world. And that meant returning once again to the testimony of Tommy Lee Edwards. Edwards became one of the central figures in the prosecution. His story connected the distant past to the defendant sitting in the courtroom. But his role was complicated. He was not a modern investigator. He was not a forensic expert. He was a participant from the era itself. His knowledge came from proximity to the events. And that gave his testimony enormous potential value. It also gave the defense an obvious target. The defense could argue that Edwards had waited too long. That memories had changed. That motives could have changed. That a person who had once remained silent might later have reasons to tell a different story. The prosecution faced those attacks directly. They argued that Edwards's testimony was supported by independent evidence. That the details he provided fit the known movements of the victims. That the broader evidence established the interstate journey. And that the jury had the responsibility of deciding credibility. The courtroom therefore became a contest between two versions of the past. One version said the government had finally uncovered a crime that had been protected by decades of silence. The other warned that the government was attempting to reconstruct a case from memories that should never have been trusted after so much time. The jury listened. And then it decided. Guilty. The word was simple. The story behind it was anything but. For the families of Moore and Dee, the conviction represented something that had been missing since 1964. Accountability. But even accountability came with a shadow. The case had taken so long that many people, who might have experienced the original investigation, were no longer alive. Some witnesses could not testify. Some investigators could not explain their decisions. Some records had become difficult to locate. The original world surrounding the crime had almost completely vanished. That made the prosecution unusual. It was not simply an old murder case. It was a prosecution against history itself. And history can be a difficult witness. It does not speak in one voice. It speaks through fragments. A newspaper article. A police report. A photograph. A family memory. A witness statement. A courtroom transcript. A name written in an old file. Sometimes one fragment confirms another. Sometimes they contradict each other. Sometimes the most important fragment is the one that disappeared. That is why investigators working decades-old cases must think differently. They are not simply collecting evidence. They are reconstructing context. They must understand what people knew at the time. What they could have known. What they had reason to fear. And why they might have remained silent. In the Moore and Dee case, context was essential. Without understanding Mississippi in 1964, the circumstances surrounding the crime could appear almost incomprehensible. Why would two young men be taken? Why would an organized group of men become involved? Why would the victims be interrogated about firearms? Why would the bodies be hidden in a river? And why would the perpetrators believe they could escape consequences? The answer was connected to the racial power structure of the time. The White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan operated in an environment where white supremacist violence was intended to intimidate black communities. The purpose of such violence extended beyond individual victims. It sent a message. Do not organize. Do not challenge the system. Do not demand political power. Do not believe that federal law can protect you. The violence was therefore political as well as personal. That context did not itself prove Seal's guilt. But it explained the environment in which the alleged crime occurred. It explained why witnesses might remain silent. And it explained why a case could survive for decades without resolution. The fear was not imaginary. People understood that speaking could have consequences. The Klan was built around secrecy. Members protected one another. Identities were concealed. And the threat of violence was part of the organization's power. In such an environment, silence could become a form of self-preservation. That silence eventually became one of the most difficult obstacles investigators faced. But time also changed the balance of power. The people who had once controlled communities through intimidation became older. Their influence declined. The civil rights movement changed federal enforcement. New generations became less willing to accept the old rules. And eventually, some witnesses became willing to speak. The reopening of the Moore and D case occurred in that changed America. It was no longer 1964. It was 2006. The legal system had changed. The political environment had changed. The country had changed. But the evidence remained tied to the past. The government had to bridge the gap. And the gap was enormous. More than 4 decades. That gap created another challenge. Public memory. Most Americans knew little about Moore and D. Their names had not become as universally recognized as other victims of the civil rights era. The case had not remained at the center of national attention. For years, it was one of many tragedies. But when the federal investigation reopened, journalists began looking again. The story returned to newspapers. Old photographs were published. Families were interviewed. The names reappeared. And people who had never heard of the 2 teenagers suddenly learned what had happened. That is another power of cold case prosecutions. They do not merely revisit evidence. They revive memory. A person who has been forgotten can become known again. A photograph can be seen again. A family story can become part of national history. For Moore and D, that process was painful but important. Their lives were no longer confined to family memories. They became part of the public record. The trial forced the country to look back. And looking back was uncomfortable. Because it exposed how long the country had tolerated unresolved racial violence. It exposed the difference between legal change and historical justice. The Civil Rights Act could change federal law. The Voting Rights Act could protect voting rights. But neither law could automatically solve every old crime. Justice still required investigators. It required evidence. It required prosecutors. And it required courts willing to examine cases that had been left behind. The Seal prosecution demonstrated that the legal system could still reach backward. But it also demonstrated how difficult that process could be. The statute of limitations fight showed how the law itself had changed over time. The defense argued that the government had no right to revive a case after so many years. The prosecution argued that federal kidnapping law allowed the charges. The courts had to determine which interpretation was correct. This was no longer a question about Mississippi alone. It was a constitutional and statutory question. Could a defendant be prosecuted decades later? Could later amendments to federal law affect an old kidnapping? What rights did the defendant have? What authority did prosecutors have? And what happened when the passage of time collided with the government's desire to prosecute? The courts examined those questions carefully. The case moved through the Fifth Circuit. At one stage, a panel ruled against the government. But the full court later became involved. The legal dispute continued. And ultimately, the conviction survived. That legal history became an essential part of the case. Because it demonstrated that the prosecution had not simply been accepted without challenge. It had been tested. The defense fought. The government responded. Judges examined the statutes. The evidence was reviewed. And the conviction endured. By the time the Supreme Court declined to hear the case, the final legal path had narrowed considerably. Seal had been convicted. He had been sentenced. The appellate process had been exhausted. The sentence remained 3 life terms. There would be no return to freedom. Yet even then, the story had an emotional contradiction. The families had waited for justice. They received it. But justice did not look the way they might once have imagined. There was no dramatic moment when the victims suddenly returned to their families. There was no reversal of history. There was only an elderly defendant being sent to federal prison. And 2 young men remaining dead. That is the brutal mathematics of delayed justice. A conviction cannot compensate for a life. A sentence cannot replace a son. A verdict cannot restore 43 years. But a verdict can establish responsibility. And sometimes that is the only form of justice still available. The families of Moore and Dee had spent decades without that certainty. The conviction changed the story. It provided an official conclusion. Not every detail. Not every unanswered question. But a conclusion strong enough to stand in federal court. That distinction mattered. Because uncertainty can be its own kind of suffering. When someone disappears, families often live in a strange space between hope and grief. They know something terrible probably happened. But without proof, they cannot fully close the door. They may imagine possibilities. They may wonder whether the person could still be alive. They may replay the final known moments. Every phone call becomes meaningful. Every unidentified body becomes a possibility. Every rumor becomes a new source of pain. For Moore and Dee, the discovery of their remains removed the uncertainty about their fate. But it did not remove the uncertainty about who was responsible. That question remained for decades. And when Seal was finally convicted, the families received an answer that had been unavailable for most of their lives. It was an answer written in legal language. But behind that language were human consequences. 2 teenagers had died. A man had been convicted. Families had waited. And a community had been forced to confront a chapter it might have preferred to forget. That confrontation is important. Because societies often prefer stories with clean endings. A crime happens. The police investigate. The suspect is arrested. The trial occurs. The verdict is delivered. The victim is remembered. The story ends. But real life rarely works that way. The Moore and Dee case did not follow that pattern. There was a disappearance. Then a discovery. Then silence. Then decades. Then an investigation. Then an indictment. Then a trial. Then an appeal. Then another legal battle. Then, finally, a conviction that survived. It was not a straight line. It was a maze. And every turn was shaped by the passage of time. That is why the case remains important to the history of American justice. It demonstrates that a cold case can become a test of institutions. Not just police institutions. Legal institutions. Historical institutions. Political institutions. And even society's willingness to remember uncomfortable events. For years, the victim's story was not at the center of national attention. Then the case was reopened. The story became visible again. And once visible, it became difficult to ignore. The names were printed. The photographs were shown. The details were discussed. The old wounds were reopened. But sometimes reopening a wound is necessary before it can be acknowledged. The United States had spent decades debating civil rights. The country had celebrated victories. It had built monuments. It had changed laws. But cases like Moore and Dee forced another question. What about the violence that happened before those changes? What about the people who died during the transition? What about the crimes that never received justice? Those questions did not disappear when the laws changed. They remained. And the Seal prosecution was one attempt to answer them. It was imperfect. It was late. It could not prosecute everyone. It could not recover every piece of evidence. It could not repair every family. But it proved that the past could still be examined. And that mattered. Because once a society accepts that old crimes are beyond accountability simply because they are old, the passage of time becomes a shield. A shield that protects the very people who benefited from delay. The Seal case challenged that idea. It showed that even after 43 years, the government could still bring a case into court. The legal system could still examine evidence. A jury could still deliberate. And a conviction could still happen. That does not mean every cold case can be solved. Most cannot. Some evidence disappears forever. Some witnesses never speak. Some suspects die. Some statutes prevent prosecution. Some cases remain mysteries indefinitely. But the Moore and Dee case demonstrated something else. A case can remain alive inside a file long after the public has stopped talking about it. The file can wait. The evidence can wait. The names can wait. And sometimes, decades later, someone opens the file. That person may find something that investigators missed. A witness. A document. A connection. A contradiction. A detail that once seemed meaningless. Suddenly, the old case changes. That is what happened here. The story moved from a forgotten chapter of 1960s Mississippi into a federal courtroom in the 21st century. And once it did, the country was forced to remember. Not the mythology of the era. Not the polished version. The violence. The fear. The secrecy. The victims. The families. The unanswered questions. And the cost of waiting. By the time James Ford Seal entered federal custody, the world in which the crime occurred was gone. The old roads were still there. The river was still there. The forest was still there. But the social order that had surrounded the crime had been transformed. The young Klansmen of 1964 were now elderly men. The teenagers they had targeted were still 19 in memory. That contrast is impossible to escape. One man lived decades beyond the crime. Two victims did not live beyond that night. And that is why the passage of time can never be treated as neutral. For the accused, time can mean a lifetime. For the victims, time stops. For the families, time becomes something they must carry. And for investigators, time becomes an enemy. The case of Charles Moore and Henry Dee showed all three realities at once. It showed what time can conceal, what time can destroy, and what time can sometimes reveal. But there was still another layer to the story. The broader question of why civil rights era cases were reopened at all. Why did federal authorities begin looking backward? Why did the government decide that crimes committed decades earlier still deserved attention? And why did some cases receive renewed investigation, while others remained unresolved? Those questions lead directly into the history of the federal government's effort to prosecute old civil rights crimes. An effort that would bring investigators back to Mississippi. Back to forgotten files. back to families who had waited, and back to names that had never truly disappeared. Among those names were Charles Moore and Henry D. 2 teenagers. 2 victims. 2 lives interrupted. And a case that proved the past can remain dangerous long after everyone believes it is over. Because sometimes the most frightening thing about a cold case is not that nobody knows what happened. It is that somebody knows. Somewhere, the truth existed. It simply took 43 years for the justice system to reach it.